Our third panelist, Dr. Camilla Toulmin, Director of the International Institute for the Environment and Development. Obviously, I'm being very short in my introductions because you have the full details in your programs. They're all very impressive. Camilla.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tom. Ken Boulding famously said that anyone who believes in exponential growth that can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And I must admit that I am trained as an economist, but I should also confess that I've strayed off the straight and narrow into the economics, politics, and ecology of natural resource use, particularly in Africa. I've spent most of my professional life working with people and places like this, trying to understand and try to improve policies and institutions as they relate to natural capital and the returns that you can make if you invest wisely in soils, water, and land. I must admit, I'd expected to find myself rather out on a limb here, but I thought I'd come all the same. But very much not the case, I'm glad to say, listening to George Soros, listening to Adair last night, listening to the Complexity Breakfast, which was very much worth getting up for, Jim just now and my other panelists. It seems that the problems we face from living in a finite world are now very much starting to enter the mainstream economics debate. So I feel quite at home. But while recognition is there, there's a much harder task, I think, in terms of putting those ideas into practice. And I think we've got a great task ahead of us in the economics profession to weave a better understanding of planetary boundaries and natural resource constraints into our analysis and how we then design that into policy institutions, and particularly providing the right signals to capital markets. As Jim, Alex, and Bill have already made clear, we have reason to be worried about breaching our planetary boundaries. This, in diagrammatic form, shows the data that Jim had in his table. It comes from Johan Rockstrom's article from Nature back in 2009, an article co-written by 30 authors. And what Johan, who runs the Stockholm Resilience Centre, tried to do was, with those authors, to get some sense with these 9 boundaries of where the safe limits might be. And he argues that for safety's sake, we should try and establish broadly where those limits are and then do our best to stay inside them. But he recognized that, there's quite poor data on some of them and a lot of uncertainty about exactly where those limits lie. And of course, I think we all hope that with clever science and research, we can push some of those limits out and give ourselves a little bit of extra space. And maybe that is and will be possible. But I think overall, the planetary balance sheet gives cause for concern, particularly when you take into account risks of thresholds and tipping points. Globally, there are 3 big arenas and opportunities to take forward thinking and action on building a sustainable economy. The first is the Durban climate change COP at the end of this year. The second, which Alex mentioned, is the Earth Summit next year, 20 years after the Great Earth Summit of Rio. And the third is the reporting date for the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, due in 2015. Now, many of us may have doubts about the potential of global summits to make much of a difference. Certainly, the huge unfulfilled expectations of Copenhagen in late 2009 shows the risks of pushing ahead with trying to get a deal, with all of the huge implications for prices, investment, competitiveness. when the underlying politics and power are poorly grasped. But it seems to me that if we can combine these three arenas, 2011, 12, and 14, together they offer us an opportunity to build consensus on broader global sustainability goals. They'd need to try and shift us towards a green economy agenda, generating competition, as Jim mentioned, around the development of low-carbon technology, competition around investing in the land, soils, and water that support current and future food supplies, and in the forests that maintain our atmospheric stability. And they would also need to give a focus to addressing the development needs of the poorer half of the planet. Now, the MDGs have been a good focus for the resources and energies of donor governments in partnership with recipient governments around this set of goals to deliver water, health, education, and so on. But they're very much a product of their time, the end of the 20th century, agreed by governments. And I think if we want a set of sustainability goals that are fit for the 2020s and beyond, they need to reflect a very different set of powers and interests and include a whole range of actors, not just government. They need to be built up from below, and they need to engage the imagination of middle and low-income countries. As we all know, we're in a process of enormous transition and shift in economic and political power across the globe, along with the ideas and influence that go with that power. And the kind of neat divide we lived in the 20th century between developed and developing countries now looks absurd. Many of the behavioral changes we urgently need to bring greater global sustainability involve hard targets for rich nations around consumption, for example. Now, we've been asked to suggest a few big research questions for sustainable economics, and I've got 5 to start with. First, can the current economic model, its assumptions, analysis, and tools allow us to achieve an economy which fits into a finite planet? Can we tweak prices and markets to integrate economics with the biophysical, governance, and institutional dimensions, or do we need to start with a blank sheet? That's a largely rhetorical question, I have to admit. Some of the complexity economics we heard about this morning might move us in the right direction, I would say. Second, what can economics and finance learn from ecological science in terms of building resilience? Using the metaphor of biodiversity, can we construct a less vulnerable system by proactive management of size and diversity of structures and their interconnections, whether we're looking at finance, energy, or other production systems? We heard yesterday about what's happened to Toyota's production in the US following the tsunami in Japan and the high levels of dependence on a single supply source for parts. We heard, too, of banks too big to fail, the Godzillas of the finance ecology. And there, perhaps, there would be room for a bit of culling in order to keep the ecosystem in balance and stop it from crashing periodically. So I think this shift from physics to biology as the sort of underlying system for understanding what's going on is a thoroughly good suggestion. Third, if we do indeed live in a finite world, we need to address the equity issue, as we've heard from our 2 previous speakers. There's a huge imbalance of consumption between and within nations. For us in the rich countries, though, is it possible to get those cuts of consumption within a democratic electoral system? Fourth, we live in a second-best world. We've seen how difficult it is to get global agreement on cuts to greenhouse gas emissions. So does this mean we should go for a regional approach, maybe? Creating sufficient scale for investment in innovation, research and technology, and maybe having a patchwork of regimes? And can we design that patchwork in a way that sooner or later the laggards will want and need to buy in? One of the speakers yesterday said that crisis, despite the pain, is a big help in achieving change. Ken Boulding produced another fine phrase when he said, economists are like computers. They need to have facts punched into them. And I think he must have been referring to the kind of computer, the mainframe, that I first got to know in my student days. But I think he should have added politicians too. We've had several well-argued studies by eminent economists like Nick Stern and Pavan Sukhdev, which show the urgent need to address climate change and protect biological diversity, showing that not only does it make good financial sense to invest now, but that we face rising costs of not doing so. Yet despite that, nothing's really happening. So my fifth question is, why is good information and evidence not enough? Is it inertia? Is it because our assumptions about rationality are wrong? Or because the current system privileges the short term and those with power today? I guess history does matter in terms of who has those embedded interests. But how do we try and find the tools and incentives to get this shift to a more sustainable economy? And I think we began to get a really interesting debate and some of the answers yesterday towards the end of the day in discussion of the power and information asymmetries involved in regulation of the financial sector. We heard also on Friday evening about the putting back together of politics and economics, which for me is a very necessary part of making economics able to address the problems of sustainability. In finance and environment, there are many common problems around asymmetric power and information, and the capacity of some powerful actors to hold tight to the benefits while pushing the costs onto others. So maybe one important thing is to find ways of organizing the countervailing power of the many losers of the current system against the few winners. So to conclude, I think there's an exciting set of big questions to address. But they're messy questions. They're questions that combine working with a range of other disciplines and at many different scales, and where pursuit of the best is often the enemy of the just about good enough. And I think we should be going for the just about good enough. So I think we should take these questions on. If not us, who? If not now, when? Thank you.